Hey folks, welcome to another Geometry Nodes tutorial. This time we're going to be doing something very simple. It's called reaction diffusion. You can see it on the left there, and it's something which happens a lot in nature, so you'll see it probably all the time now that you're aware of it. But this is obviously an animated version of it, but some of the main examples are things like coral, bacteria, mold, and things like how you get different color on animal pelts like zebras, leopards, things like this. We're actually going to be able to make some of these sorts of patterns just by controlling two things. So in nature, they are called the activator and the inhibitor, and it's basically the reaction as one comes in and then the other one comes in. And this is why you need a gradient, because the activator is trying to go to white, the inhibitor is trying to go to black. And so you sort of have this fighting situation where it resolves down to this really nice pattern. It is a little bit of black magic because we're balancing two things that are not entirely obvious, like the intuitive nature isn't quite there, but I will show you the sort of limits that we can work with and how to get some really fun effects out of it. For this tutorial, you're going to need simulation nodes. So either you're still going to be using a branch of simulation nodes, in which case linked in the description, or simulation nodes might have been merged into master by the time this is released, in which case, again, link in the description, you'll just need a 3.6 alpha build or beta, or it's the future, and 3.6 is released with simulation nodes. Coming here, let's jump in with a plane. Because we're doing in geometry nodes, we are sampling geometry, which means the resolution is defined by the resolution of the geometry. You could do this with a sphere, you could do this with a plane. Do you know what? Let's do this with a sphere, actually. That can look fun. But let's just make it in geometry nodes. So we can set the resolution how we want. I'm going to use an icosphere because we get really nice, evenly spaced points. So if I set my subdivision to 5, we get something like this, and we can just kind of keep going until we get the resolution we want. Obviously, super high resolution, super low performance. So just be careful how you balance this. But the higher the resolution, the better it will look. On top of our geometry, we also need an attribute. So let's initialize an attribute outside our simulation. So we're going to use a store named attribute in here. And I'm just going to call this one texture. It's going to be a texture. In fact, we can start off just with a noise texture. Let's use a noise texture fac. The factor just means it's a 0 to 1 value. That's how Blender signifies that. 3D is fine. I'm going to turn off my detail. Let's just have a look at this. That was Control-Shift left click. And I'm going to also turn off my wireframe drawing. There we go. And I'm going to drop this down something around here. We can see the icosphere is taking 70 milliseconds. Let's just drop that one level. That's a bit better. This process is based on gradients. So we want a texture which has some nice undulations in it. So something like a noise texture is fine. Something like a Voronoi distance is fine. If you have flat areas, it just behaves a little bit differently. And I think when you have gradients, it's much more satisfying to look at. So we have our initial texture, and this is going to be guiding the overall shape of our reaction diffusion. Now let's set up the rest of this loop. We're going to need this to be recursive because it needs to happen, and then it needs to look at the current pattern that we see here, and it's going to need to accentuate some of the whites and darken some of the blacks. So let's go ahead and add a simulation zone. By the way, I know some people are not a fan of the purple here. You can go up to Edit, Preferences, Themes, and then go down to Node Editor. And if you look for the purple thing, there we go, Simulation Zone. So you can change how you want this to look. If you want it to be a bit more neon and opaque, then you can do whatever you want with this. I'm going to leave mine bright. So you can obviously play this however you want. Store named attribute goes into your simulation input, simulation output goes to your geometry output, and we're going to simply duplicate our store named attribute inside the loop. It's going to be the same attribute, we're just going to be working on top of it. Now, because we are feeding this in sort of like this in series, when this loop starts happening, this gets cut. So we end up with this just being our input from frame 0. Beyond this point, it's going to be from within the loop. So we need to set up our activator and our inhibitor. Let's just add a named attribute so that we can see this at the end, copy and paste. And I'm going to view this like this. Okay. Now, let's take another one of our named attributes. With our texture attribute, we are going to, first of all, blur it. So blur, and I'm just going to leave these as defaults. I am then going to blur my blurred attribute. So this one is going to be the effect of our activator. This is going to be the effect of our inhibitor. And yes, they're sort of based on each other, and it is the interaction between the two that creates the effect. Let's multiply our top blur, the first blur. This value we'll get onto in a minute, but let's just set this to 1.2 for now. Just trust me, we'll come back to it. And then we're going to use a subtract afterwards. So we're going to take our multiply into the top and we're going to subtract from it our blur. So if we look at our geometry here, we have our basic gradient. We increase the dynamic range of that. So now it's going from 0 to 1.2. And then we have our blurred gradient. And then we simply subtract from our higher values that previous one. And so you can think of this like on a graph. So let's say we have a shape like this. If we were to blur this shape, we would end up with something sort of through the middle, something like this. Now, if our first version of this is also a little bit higher, we've increased the range of that, then this subtraction will actually accentuate the shape, because at the ends you can see that we are moving down further, and in the middle we're moving down less far. So we end up with quite a steep shape, but now you can see some of these are above, some of these are below 0. Now we just need to make sure that we are also doing another multiplication at the end, and something super important, both of these multiplies need to always be above 1. You will notice as we start working with this loop, anytime either of your multiplies goes below 1, you basically just disappears the effect. Let's take our second multiply here. I'm just going to set it to 3 for now. I think that's a pretty good starting point, and then we can play with how we want this to interact with each other afterwards. So it is the ratio of this multiply to this multiply, and a little bit of the effect of how many blur iterations you have on each of these. That is what is going to control the effect. So lots of blur iterations, you're going to have a much broader effect, and the difference in your different multiplies is going to change the speed and how joined up or separated the blobs become. I know we're talking very much in abstracts at the moment, so let's get this plugged in properly. Connect this up here. And then we have our texture working. And now, so if I just go ahead and press play, then you can see that something is happening. Now this has gone crazy, crazy bright, and there's kind of two things that we need to be aware of. One, this multiply needs to be clamped. In Blender, if you have a math node and you clamp it, it will limit the result to the 0 to 1 range. And that basically just stops this from going crazy. Because this is recursive, it's going to do the same thing over and over. If we are multiplying by 3 every time, then it's going to have a big effect. However, if we clamp this, well, because we're doing these other parts before, we're blurring it, and then we're subtracting them together, and then we're doing this multiplication, it just steepens that gradient, and it makes it a little bit tighter where we start to get that rippling effect. So this multiply is going to be important for that. Let's go back to the beginning, shift left. So if we play this, we can see that it does get a bit more interesting on the way to becoming just black. So become something, and then as we keep going, this something goes down to nothing. Let's make sure that we can visualize this as we go here as well. So let's build a little shader to make it really obvious what's going on. We're going to take our texture. I'm going to use a sets material node. We don't have any materials right now, so let's make one in our shader editor. I'm going to call it Viz. There we go. And I'm going to take my texture as an attribute through an attribute input node. So copy and paste. Make sure that we are in Eevee so that we can see. And when we view the output of this, here we go. So we have our texture directly. Let's also put this through a threshold. So I'm going to find a map range. Some people like to use greater than. I like to make sure that there is always a little bit of fall off. I don't like it to be completely sharp. So let's go from 0.24 to 0.26. That'll do us. Going to use this in a mix node, mix color as the factor. Again, 0 to 1 value, so it's a factor. And we can set some colors. Let's go, I think in my example I was using blue and white. Something like this is fine. Through into our base color, and also we can use this thresholding stuff to control roughness. So you might as well do that as well. I'm going to change this to a float mix, same factor. I'm going to plug into our roughness. Everything's going to go real shiny. Let's make sure that we are making it shiny where we want to. So I'll go 0.1 on the blue section and maybe 0.8 on the white section. So it's just the top bit that's shiny. All right, that is it for the shader. Something nice and simple for us there. I'm going to bring this down to the bottom. And I'm also going to, you can see this is faceted. Let's also set shade smooth in geometry nodes. There we go. All right. So as soon as we play, it all sorts of disappears very quickly. So this is really to do with, I mean, we've done the node setup now. There's maybe one thing we want to add just to get a nicer effect as we move forwards. But first of all, we can simply balance these blurs and multiplies until we get the effect that we're after. So maybe I'll set this up to 0.125. Let's try this. Go back to the beginning. That's a little bit better. Maybe increasing the blurring on here. So, okay, this is probably one of the larger culprits for what's happening right now. Let's increase our blurring amount, maybe to 6. Oh, there we go. It's doing something immediately. So we're seeing some of this artifacting around the outside of our shapes. And this is actually just caused by topology. If you have more topology, if I set this back to 7, it's going to render a little bit slower, but you're going to see that a lot of these things pop in here together. This is topology dependent. If I drop this way down, you're going to see the effect of this is limited to the topology. With an icosphere, you can see we have these poles as well, and we can actually have some fun with our noise texture now. So let's do some of the different stuff that we want to try out here. So if I have a look at my noise texture, I'm going to add a map range, and let's just have a look at this when let's make some of these areas actually black. So let's just clamp this to like 0.5 to 1. And then let's see what happens. So we'll go back to the beginning. Okay, so everywhere that had a gradient got filled first, and then it just sort of trickles across. Now it's trickling quite quickly because of this blur being quite high. If I set this to like 3, it should be a little bit slower because this blur distance essentially is less. So when we increase our initial blur, you see that we get a whole bunch of points, like leopard spots, and then they start creeping. So this process is just super fun. Let's make it a little bit more dynamic. Let's use this for displacement. We need a set position. I wonder if we should blur it just to make it a little bit cleaner on these edges for the shader. Again, we're going to use the same store named attribute outside the loop this time. We're just going to blur our attribute. Let's see if this, oh, that does look better. Things are just a little bit more rounded with it than without it. So I'm going to keep this blur on here as well. So we've just got texture with one blur step. We're going to take our texture here directly into a scale vector math node. It's going to be at the bottom. We're just going to be scaling along the surface normals. Keep it nice and simple. Let's plug this into our offset. Oh, that's that's not what we're after. So let's scale this down a little bit as well. Now, in order for us to make this a little bit more bulbous, like, you know, semicircles coming out of the surface here, because we're always working in a 0 to 1, because this multiply is clamped before storing the texture, then it means that this texture is clamped, which means that we can put it through a float curve. And that means we can do whatever we want. So I could do something like this, and that's going to be a little bit steeper. Let's make sure that our texture is using a slightly different part. Something like this is fine. Maybe these should be pulled in very slightly to stop them from joining up too badly. There we go. And then we can make these more round. All right, so you can have all sorts of fun. I do just want to make sure that we are covering as much of this as possible. Just for the effect, you know. Now it does seem to be throwing off a little bit with this float curve. So I might just S-curve it a little bit, just give me a little bit more tolerance on that edge, just so it's not so obviously on the outside of our colour. And I will drop our extrusion. There we go. So this is looking pretty good. But again, we want to come back in and start balancing our values. And this is where we can get into a lot of, have a lot of fun with it, because this multiply, I would recommend if you're using textures or images or anything like that, then you plug them into the multiplies, not so much into the blur attributes. I found that you get some weird artifacting if you change the weights or the iterations by a texture. So what we really want to do here is just use these multiplies, and let's just let it play, and then we're going to see what happens. So we can change these dynamically, which is how we can do fun animations and things. So if I let this come out quite high and then I start dropping this down, now it's going to have that dotty effect because that's how it was developing. However, on the boundaries of all of those shapes that we just made to begin with when it was flooding, we can do all sorts of things. So you can imagine how you can sort of play around with this. Now let's try our second multiply. So if I increase this, then again, we get a lot of sort of branching things going on. And this is probably a lot of the time the sort of effect that you're after. So a nice ratio of values is probably 0.125 and maybe 3.6, something like that. And that'll give you a nice split of these long ones with a few short ones. And it's going to just fill the space nicely there as we come through. Let's make sure we have enough frames to actually watch it all the way. Let's just add a 0. So you can have lots of fun with this. Try playing with your multiply values, and again, if you set this to 0.9, it disappears very quickly. This is recursive, so these values, as soon as you go below 1, things start dropping very quickly. So make sure you keep this 1 or higher, and you can play with your values in here until you get some effects that you like. Now, if you want to use a texture, there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. So I'm just going to pull in the Blender logo for us to play with. Grab an image texture node, open the Blender logo that of course you have downloaded. And we need to do some mapping vectors for this. If I just use this by default on our icosphere, you can see it's simply projected down from above. The image texture node in geometry nodes is not by default using UVs, it is using the position vector. And that's why you get this kind of pattern. Now in 3.6 we have this UV output socket. Let's just use this, and we're going to need to do a little bit of remapping here to make this nice. So let's add in here a vector math as well. We will drop this under multiply add, basically just does a multiply and then an add. So if I increase the size of this, we'll get more. And if I decrease it, we'll get less. I'm going to change this from repeat to extend, just so that we get 1. And then I'm going to add until I've got it moved into a place we can see it. There we go, something like this. Looks pretty good to me. So I'm just going to use these values basically to control my multiplications. I would recommend probably not using this as your input because when we're doing this for effects, we want to have a different reaction diffusion based on the image. That's how we're going to draw out the image. If we just use it as the input, well, let's try that. So I'm going to take a map range onto our color output. So it'll just compress it down into a float value. And let's plug this into our initial store attribute, the one before our loop. And we're not getting anything. So let's make sure that we can also see what this is outputting. Okay, that would be Y. So we want to go down. Let's make sure that we've got a nice range in here towards 0 and 1. Okay, so starting off, we have a Blender logo. Nice. Now when I press play, you can see that basically just the edges of that Blender logo, because it was a hard flat color, they're just going to, as we blur these entire areas, they don't have a gradient on them. So there's nothing really for us to be solving. It's only when we blur it that we create a gradient across what was a hard edge. And that is how we're going to get this kind of tracking effect. But you can see that because this is just generally quite an empty area, you're only going to get the effect sort of growing out of a point. Higher multiply on that second one increases your chances of branching. You can make it more extreme if you want to have, some branching or whatever. Then you can do that and you can make it more interesting. But you're very quickly going to lose the original Blender logo. So if we want to actually be able to see our logo, then we need to basically use the logo to control how it resolves. And we can just use a generic texture like a noise texture or a Voronoi distance to be our initial impulse. So let's take our image texture. We're going to pass this up into, let's try in the second multiply. So let's say that we have background color of 2.5 and a foreground color of 4.5. That might be interesting. And then we're just going to see how this resolves. Okay, so the part that's on the Blender logo, that resolves quite quickly, but we need a little bit more everywhere else. So let's go up to maybe 3.5 for the rest of the background. And let's just restart our animation whenever we want this. Okay, so now we're getting spots in the background and we're getting these nice edges for our Blender logo. I know we clamped off our noise texture before. I'm just going to set this back to a 0 to 1 range just so that we can resolve everything kind of evenly. So that's pretty fun. We get spots around our Blender logo. Let's see what happens if we change our blur attributes. So maybe we definitely want them to be different. So with this first one quite low, we do seem to get much finer details on this. Much more mesh dependent though. You can see those triangles coming in there. It resolves quite nicely, but we do want to blur it a little bit. So the first blur is going to control how much of our initial topology comes through there. And we're getting a lot of spots because our values are set up to give us a lot of spots. Let's also, in that case, use another map range for our initial multiply. So this time we're going to go for the foreground, let's go 1.1, and for the background, let's go 1.6. Let's just see. Okay, let's try dropping this down a little bit. See how we're starting to get some nice little sections coming in through here. So it's around about that 1.25-ish area and the 3 or above for the background. You can have a lot of fun just playing with these values just until you get something that you like the look of. Now, I know there's going to be questions for this, so just very quickly here, let's have a look at how we can resolve this to just curves. This is a little bit challenging without changing the node setup. So we're going to do the best that we can without actually changing anything. And it's quite a simple process. So come to the end of our node tree, we are going to, instead of doing a set position, let's mute that, we are going to delete geometry where our texture is less than some value. Let's plug this in like this, and we can just start creeping this up. So straight away, you can see that we've got a nice little mask on here. Looks pretty great. What we really want is, well, I suppose you could take the outlines if you wanted the outlines, or what is probably more useful to more people is just bring it in. You don't want to disconnect sections, so make sure that you do still have at least a sort of a wire coming across like this. And then we're simply going to merge by distance. We're going to set this to connected, so it will only merge within a connected island. We're just going to increase the distance until we find that we're collapsing those faces. We don't want to go too far because you're going to lose a lot of your detail. We just want it to be slightly larger than a face. And you can play with that until you find it. Somewhere around there for me. And then I will also just do a mesh to curve. So now we have curves that we can do things with. For example, you could skin these up. So you could do a curve to mesh, CTM, and we could put a circle curve on here. Let's drop our radius right down. And there we go. And then we can simply add one of our spheres, and that'll look pretty good. And because this is all like a post-process effect, it's all still going to work live. So the actual resolving of the reaction diffusion, this is happening within this silo inside this simulation loop. So whenever you're doing things like blurring your texture output to make this nicer for the shader, or doing any of these extra bits that might impact the geometry, for example, make sure that you do those outside. There wants to be a very clear division between your simulation loop, which is very simple, and any sorts of mesh operations that you're doing. So keep your workspace clean. So as you can see, this effect is super easy to come up with. You're basically just using a store named attribute node to cycle a very simple effect on a gradient. So we're doing a blur and then re-blurring and doing the subtraction of the two. Some things to consider: if you're doing this in simulation nodes and you want to do it animated with different objects, those objects need to come into the middle of the simulation loop. They can't come in through the start. You have to remember with simulation nodes, as soon as the simulation starts, that is a closed loop. So just something to consider. Super fun effect and a really great little simulation nodes primer. Hope you've had fun, hope you've learned something. I'll catch you in the next one.